We'll kick off. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our fourth webinar at the British Chamber of Business here. Delighted to have co-panelists Rian Geldenhuys and Nick Latta, who will introduce himself shortly. Obviously, my VP Cecilia will be here today, feeding in the questions, and we've got Ema in mission control running the polls. So really what we want to do today is make this as interactive as possible, encourage a good debate, because day 35 lockdown, as the song we just heard says, I think we've made it through the darkest part of the night, and hopefully we're going to start opening up. But what does this stage 4 opening up mean? I know 0500 hours tomorrow morning, Cecilia is going to be running. She's been dying to do that for the last 34 days. I'm not sure if I can go grab a coffee, go to my office. What does it actually mean for us? So we're going to be exploring that with our expert panelists. And again, I just want to encourage us to be as interactive as possible. And really, we can share our knowledge, guide each other as to how we're going to navigate this, but equally garner information so we can take this back to Boost or to government to push back and really start taking a bit more control about this situation. What I found in the recent weeks, it's been very frustrating waiting for things to happen to us. And I get the sense now that business, and particularly us at the Chamber, we want to take back a little bit of control and really start pushing back and managing this more proactively. We want to do that on your behalf, but equally we want to do it with you. So without further ado, perhaps Rian, you could introduce yourself, and then Nick, and then we'll get into the content of this webinar.
Hello everyone, all the members and non-members alike. My name is Rian Geldenhuys. I'm the CEO of Trade Law Chambers. We're international trade law advisors, so predominantly we're commercial attorneys, and we specialize in that niche when there's a cross-border aspect to any trade aspect. But of course, we also assist companies, when they're operating in a specific market, and tell them exactly how it is that they can operate. So obviously, during a national lockdown as a result of COVID-19, that's something that we have to take attention of and advise our clients accordingly. And that's me. Nick, over to you.
Just unmute yourself there, Nick.
I'm the Prosperity Counsellor at the British High Commission in Pretoria. Over the until last week, I've spent most of lockdown as an airline coordinator, trying to get people back to the UK. It's the second time I've run an airline. This time felt a lot more coherent and safer, albeit rather greater numbers. And the good news is we got over 2,000 Brits visiting back home. The challenge is that we were only focused on British nationals who were visiting, and therefore there are still a large number of people who are resident or who have a longer term option in South Africa who are here and who have seen the latest information about the move from level 5 to level 4 and the wider advertisements of when we might get air travel, and are now looking to have another chance of a flight back home. So I may become an airline operator once again. I'm not sure yet. It'll be quite complicated to get there. In the meantime, I'm starting to think about how we in the High Commission can support South Africa through the next couple of phases of the crisis, which we've framed as economic resilience, retaining as much as we possibly can through the crisis, and then moving through to economic recovery, and to pick a phrase from the climate change agenda, to build back better.
Nick, I'm intrigued. This is the second time you've run an airline. What was the first?
Libyan Arab Spring evacuating British citizens. That was really dodgy. Not one to repeat.
Perhaps we can revisit that and some of the kind of, I know Ema's tell me I've got to stop making my Blitz and World War II analogies, but perhaps it's a useful metaphor to discuss how we can tackle this situation. And I think most of you know Cecilia, but I'll let her introduce herself.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I'm Cecilia from the Chamber. I'm going to be moderating and feeding in your questions again to the panelists today. Thank you all for joining us. particularly also, we are as ever going to be feeding in some polls that we'd love to hear your comments on and get a sense of what you guys are thinking out there. I think after some more details were released by the government last night on what level 4 exactly will mean, I think the biggest shocker was the U-turn on the cigarette sales, which is going to be a bigger problem for some than others. Ruth, our felicitations. I know this was horrible news for you, but you get to have your say right now about whether you think the sale of cigarettes should be allowed again. What did not come as a surprise is that alcohol will still be prohibited, although the export of wine has now been allowed. So I think it's still quarantinis for most of us, which is our experimental cocktails mixed from whatever random ingredients you still have left in your cupboard at this stage. Right, first poll is going. Please raise your hand.
Thanks, Cecilia. Perhaps I'll be intrigued to know what concoctions we have for quarantinis. So interesting. It would be interesting to explore why people believe, quite a large number believe it should still be prohibited. I know what camp Ruth is in. I take the more libertarian stance myself and believe we should be allowed to drink and smoke should we want to. But perhaps we'll come back to that. But Rian, maybe you can kick us off. What are the essential changes that are going to kick in at 0500 hours tomorrow, taking us from level 5 to level 4? What are the headlines?
Well, the headlines, Leon, I think, when you're looking at these kind of things, it's always very important to kind of have a look back as to what has happened, previously, because it kind of informs you in a certain sense as to what's going to happen going forward. But we'll park that there for the moment. I think a major thing that is going to change is more manufacturing industries are going to be able to come online, most of which will be coming online in a phased-in approach. The first scaling, it seems to be, is going to go up to 25% of employment numbers and then all the way up to 50%. In some sectors, you're going to see 100% employment. And then for all manufacturing sectors that's not specifically mentioned in terms of their phased approach or fully being open, they're going to be able to allow to open up until 30% of their current employment. However, it's not as easy as just, waking up tomorrow morning and going back to work. There are lots of issues to consider. Like Cecilia mentioned, last night we did see the new regulations coming out. These are generic in the sense that some of the regulations will apply to the entire phase of lockdowns, as we may know it. So level 5 from being most restrictive all the way to level 1 being the least restrictive, and then specifically for level 4. But again, the regulations that were published pertaining to level 4 are again generic to the level. So every single sector will see their own regulations coming out. And every single minister has been designated with the powers to regulate further within the sectors or domains under their control. So I think we're likely to see quite a lot more coming out. I mean, as an example, another thing that we saw late yesterday was the Department of Labour coming out with their particular directive on what companies would need to do, or at least businesses need to do, in order to allow for employees to return back to work. It's not something that you can implement from today in order to start tomorrow.
Yeah.
Some of them, of course, would have already operated in that way, for instance, the agro-processing sector, but for others, it's a brand new challenge, and they need to make sure that they're aware of the regulations and know that they can correctly implement it. But I think that is the soundbite. I mean, cigarettes and alcohol aside, at least manufacturing is returning. We're going to see some imports and exports also going back out again. We've got specific provisions for that, but I'll get to that once we get there. But I think those are the headlines.
Thanks, Rian. We'll come back to some of the points you raised there, particularly around how does an organization actually prepare to go back to work 0500 tomorrow when we've actually been in lockdown.
And
Nick, sorry, if
I could just interject, just to all of our attendees, I left out, I got all sidetracked by quarantinis. We're open to your questions throughout the conversation. So if at any stage you've got a question related to what someone's just said or anything random, please post it at the So.
Yeah, no, thanks, Cecilia. And as you reminded me to mention, we are actually being recorded, so we will share this webinar with you after the event. And before I hand over to Nick, I've got a question from Faye at Homecoming Revolution, who just WhatsApped me. Essentially, are we considered professional services? Can we go back to work? Yeah, I'd like to think so, but actually, we don't actually know. And I think that's going to be a theme throughout this webinar in terms of there's probably going to be lots of pushback and questions requiring further clarity around us starting to work again. Nick, what have you taken from the move from 5 to level 4?
So I think I would be slightly cautious, basing and highlighting the marginal difference in terms of threat, because I think it's really easy to feel after 5 weeks of lockdown, my God, we just want to get out. But actually, if you look at it in terms of this is a response to an established threat, that we were at level 5, which meant high virus spread and or low readiness. We've now moved to moderate to high virus spread with low to moderate readiness. So there's not a huge amount of change in the threat. So whatever we are notionally enabled to do, I think should come with a pretty high caveat of if you can continue to operate working from home, you definitely should. And this is not just because the government tells us to, although that's an important point, but moreover because that's the safe way of operating at a time when you have both 350 new cases a day and a creeping death rate. So there remains a real threat that we need to be considering at the same time as starting to innovate how we open up and how we adjust our business models to the new criteria, with a hope and a dream that we might one day get to level 3 or even level 2. But I think we need to recognise that actually, in terms of the infection rate, the government's done a great job in flattening the curve, but it's still 2 to 350 a day.
So I've been hearing from a lot of members and businesses internationally in terms of, and again, Nick, I think it's worth opening Pandora's box and really exploring what that threat is. The existential threat of COVID versus the real threat of further economic degradation and what are the health consequences because of the lack of economic activity, in terms of social dislocation, starvation, people turning to crime. I mean, where I live, it's quite a peaceful environment, but we've had 2 lots of armed attacks in the last 3 weeks. So maybe, I don't want to go off topic, but I think it's essential to, what's motivating us as business to be active again. How real do we think that threat is versus the secondary threats that perhaps we haven't explored in great detail, but I believe people are starting to talk about more and more. I saw a great article from the CEO of PSG and also from a group of doctors in Cape Town who were basically saying, we understand why this decision was taken with decisive leadership from the president, but actually we now need to consider what are those secondary threats that actually might be greater than the real threat of COVID. And maybe we can discuss that for a while. And I welcome input from the audience. So Rian, I know this is not really what Trade Law Chambers is about, but I think it's central to everything that we're navigating at the moment.
Leon, you're absolutely right. As soon as this thing kind of really started landing here, that was one of our major considerations. What's going to happen to the economy? What are people going to return to at the end of this? So whether that's December, or September, or no one knows. What will be left? But it's a difficult question, and I've also read some great articles, the ones you mentioned particularly. But I've also seen some articles that saying, listen, it's not really health response that causes the massive economic decline and everything that goes with it, but really it is the pandemic, and it's just how do you adapt to that? And I think on that, I can probably give a little bit more comment is, if we're seeing what our leaders have said in terms of the modeling that they're looking at, Nick is very correct in saying that we're now at this somewhat moderate level, but it's very likely that we're going to go back to level 5 once we see the spike again, which is predicted and which has happened in every single country that we've seen the pandemic in thus far. So I think that is a likelihood. I also think it's a likelihood that, depending on where it is in the country and where the spikes may be, that those districts, municipal areas, metropoles, provinces, whatever it may be, they might go to different levels of lockdown, so to speak. And of course, then, there's this idea that we also have to look at, which government has clearly outlined from a health perspective, and of course, it also feeds into the economics of it. But they've said, quite clearly that first and foremost, the major thing that we're looking at here in terms of the 3 criteria that we consider is what's the risk of transmission. So those sectors that has the lowest risk of transmissions, for them, it's easy to go back. Secondary to that, then we either look at, what's the value of your industry to the economy, to the people, socially, etc. And then, or it's a nice to have is, what's the impact if you should remain closed? So those are completely and utterly secondary considerations at this particular point in time, and really going to, what can we do in order to make sure that, the risk of transmission is absolutely minimized. And yeah, Leon, to get back to your original question, and hopefully, like Nick also mentioned, we can become innovative and, try and, mitigate that risk of transmission as much as possible in order to see whether we can't, claw back economically speaking.
Yeah, thanks, Rian. I mean, Nick, you make the points, and it's really is a difficult leadership task. The decisions you make have huge impact. And we can see we've all been very proud of our president in South Africa. And in terms of, we've seen the physical strain on his face as well. It must be torturous taking in all this advice from scientists, from business, saying, whatever decision I make, we're going to make somebody unhappy, and it can lead to potentially to tens of thousands of deaths. It's the ultimate challenge in leadership. But understanding the risk profile at level 4 and what Rian said, what are the elegant ways we can navigate this in terms of balancing economic activity with protecting us from the pandemic?
So just to pick up on the pressures and the challenges that South Africa faces, one of the things, while there's real value in looking at globally at lessons learned, it's also worth flagging that South Africa is now judged to be a unique test case for what happens in a population that has 20% HIV and an even higher incidence of TB, both diseases which would seemingly affect really significantly the prognosis of recovery. So if you were approaching this with a risk-based model, you would conclude that South Africa has to be more cautious until you have better information than other countries have been. So that's the first thing I'd flag. The second thing I'd flag is I saw a great thing on Twitter the other day about the Y2K paradox.
Yeah.
And I think this is we're in a very similar situation, that if you really nail and do your lockdown and flattening the curve effectively, not only are you going to irritate people because economic activity has been curtailed, but they're going to conclude that you did so for no reason at all because you've been successful at containing the virus. What we don't know is the implication of not locking down, and not just on deaths, but on economic activity. How willing would people be to go to the shops or to go and carry on operating routinely if tens of thousands of people were now infectious and falling ill, and you had over 1,000 deaths, 5,000 deaths? That would probably change quite significantly our individual choices on what was an acceptable activity and our own risk appetite. So it's very difficult to judge what would have happened in the absence of a lockdown.
Yeah.
The last thing I'd say, again, I'm ducking slightly your question, I will come to it. There is a real value to flattening the curve. Just this week, we've seen news out of the US that remdesivir, which was designed for Ebola, has a material benefit, palliative benefit to treatment. Now that's a really big new step forward in a time when effectively, when we went into lockdown, there was no cure. There was no way of treating this apart from keeping somebody just about alive with enough oxygen to let their own body work it out. More of these things will come through. Vaccines may come through. Improved understanding and analysis of treatments in China and Italy and everywhere else. So I think that while we have suffered, there is a real value to having successfully flattened the curve. Coming back to your question.
Yeah.
In terms of how do we innovate and how do we adapt to the shift? For me, there are certain things that, and certainly this is what we're doing in the High Commission, is actually we could move to much higher rates of office working than we intend to. Partly because we see no need. We have tested and proven that we can do a lot of our business remotely, and therefore when there is added risk of moving people around, why take it?
Yeah. I think, Nick, thanks for all those points and indeed Rian's, and just to comment on a few, I think certainly it does really show how being a leader, a global leader, is critical, and we can see where it's done well in New Zealand, arguably with Jacinta Ardern, arguably in Germany with Frau Merkel, and then very badly, and I'm being recorded on the record, we can see the chaos that is America at the moment, and the public sentiment for our own Prime Minister in the UK, and equally the President here, kind of being very dignified and statesmanlike. All these factors one has to consider as a leader. So actually, how important it is that we elect the right people, not through populist choice, but having confidence in our leaders that they will surround themselves with the right people to help them make the decisions. What will certainly change going forward in this post-COVID world is the world of work will not be the same again. You know, the case has been proven that working from home does work. But again, a question really to trigger conversation, we can move on, is we're working based on, with colleagues and clients that we've built up years of trust through that face-to-face interaction. You know, from the members on, from Faye, from Amanda, from Ruth on the call, you trust us because we've engaged personally. You know, we've met each other. Rutendo and I were in London at the African Investment Summit in January. We've traveled together. And how do we nurture those new relationships going forward with new clients, with new colleagues, when we're going to do it 80% virtually? So, my hypothesis is, yes, we can do a lot of this, but we can never really replace that human interaction where we come together to build that trust. Because it would just take so long to build that trusting relationship through a virtual relationship. Just observations there, Rian, in terms of how you see the new world of work playing out. But before we perhaps look at what are the implications of school openings, domestic workers, how can we realistically keep going on working from home with 2 working parents, limited support, but really just maybe exploring that new world of work and what we see has changed and will not shift back.
Thanks, Leon. I absolutely agree with you. The world of work is going to change. And while we're on the topic of change, I don't think anything is going to be the world of work. I think many concepts that we've taken as given are going to change. For instance, in my field, international trade, I think, a lot of things within international trade will change dramatically. If you think about, for instance, the global value supply chains that we used to have, those things are going to be relooked. People are going to see, I can't only rely on, 2 countries in order to get my products in or my inputs, or whatever it is that I need. I need to have stuff closer to home, wherever it is that we have, again, in our history, something similar to this, that we will still be able to thrive and to survive on that. But yes, definitely in terms of the world of work, I think things have changed dramatically. And it's going to probably be like that for a long time coming. office space and that sector, I fear for them. So I think lots of the guys are trying to get out of those kind of leases. People are trying to, make arrangements in terms of the bonds that they're paying off. And also because we have now shown that to a certain extent, working from home does work. It's not the be-all and end-all solution. We still need some interaction. You're possibly going to see that, businesses are going to scale down in terms of any office space that they have and, move more towards, stuff like art desking with limited space. So instead of having 4,000 square meters, you have 400 square meters and people come in on a rotational basis. The teams that need to work together or individuals within teams working together in order to get, things done in the brainstorming session and whatnot. So I really think that that's the time has come for people to really reevaluate that. And I think if you don't reevaluate that, we're going to sit in a situation where those businesses who do not take cognizance of this, they will flounder.
Yeah. If I can just, Cecilia. If I can jump in there, I completely agree. I think we've known that the new world of work and remote work working is definitely the way to go. Not even getting to a better effect on traffic and all of that. But I think what's different under the lockdown situation is the fact that very few people have help at home, which they usually would have had, and children are not allowed to go to school. So it's becoming, from what I've been hearing, and as Faye also pointed out in her comment, it's rather an unsustainable situation at the moment for parents who've got children at home, are required to work from home and deliver, but find it impossible to do so. And we've got our next poll coming up. This relates to the schools opening, but really also just childcare and how it impacts your ability to be productive from home or anywhere else. And I'm wondering, under lockdown levels 4, with schools still remaining closed, with nannies and caretaker services still not really being allowed or being reactivated, how much can people really deliver?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It'll be interesting to see the responses. While we're waiting for those to come through, Nick, maybe you can comment on the work as a diplomat, internationally, working on diplomatic relations and trade and repatriations. I saw how hard your team was working getting those 2,000 Brits back. But how much can you adjust your world of work, given the very nature of what you do is about relationships and engagement?
Thanks, Leon. So yeah, I think your question on how we generate new relationships has been one I've started to grapple with. How do we build out our networks as diplomats when, as you say, these virtual conversations work well on the back of established and effective trusting relationships? I'm an eternal optimist, so I suspect that as we get more used to these sorts of new ways of working, we will our trust, our sense of trust will shift. If you think about checks or physical signatures, those things are, 20 years ago you couldn't do anything without a raft of physical signatures and stuff. Now an e-signature, or indeed just a sort of a click on in a box, is accepted as an effective and trusted response. So I think over time we can adjust. In terms of how does business change, I completely agree with Rian's point about supply chains. I think that's going to be really profound. The other one I would flag is the airline industry. We're already seeing the airline industry under real pressure, but I think, as BA was saying this week, it's going to take years to recover. I think particularly if you look at, say, the BA model, which prioritized business travel. Business travel, I suspect, will be one of the slowest to recover, because businesses will have invested so substantially in virtual connectivity, and that they will conclude that they need to travel far less. particularly at the sorts of prices that business travel charges. And with a lot of the bigger airlines basing their entire business model around business travelers, that's going to be a real challenge. But in terms of our business, you may have seen this year was supposed to be about two things for Africa and the UK. One was the UK's re-engagement, amping up its investment with Africa, and the other was globally around climate change.
Yeah,
we have postponed COP26, yet to set a date, but it'll be sometime into 2021. But actually, what's really interesting for me around the sort of the intersection between the story of COVID and the story of climate change is, first off, I saw recent figures that said, despite the utter collapse in driving and air travel, we've only, over the last 8 weeks, the world has only seen a 5% drop in greenhouse gas emissions.
wow.
Now, given that you've got to hit a 7+% drop per year to hit our objectives, we're going to have to do a whole lot more than simply not go on holiday by flying. But equally, you've got this really interesting moment where the world has shifted its economic principles massively on the back of scientific evidence. So there is a window and an opportunity for us to build on that, to say, actually, okay, so we're now really comfortable with the idea that when scientists say this is going to be cataclysmically bad, we need to change our approach. We change our approach. Now that does offer quite an opportunity for climate science, for example.
That's fascinating, Nick. You know, in terms of, I think one of the silver linings might have been seeing dolphins swimming in the canals of Venice and wallabies hopping through the streets of Melbourne. But actually, the climate change reduction has not been significant. So to shift the dial thoroughly, we need to be locked down for years, potentially. Perhaps we can take a look at the poll results in terms of the impact of working from home. Wow. So we can see that, interestingly, it's pretty much 50-50 in terms of major impact versus moderately impact. And I wonder if that depends on your children's age and the support you have at home. I mean, I have teenage, a 19-year-old and a 13-year-old, and live in help. So as much as the house has been crowded and noisy, and the boys have been as frustrated as me about missing the rugby and not being able to travel, we can actually all kind of get on in our own worlds. Whereas perhaps if you've got younger children, which I know a lot of my colleagues have, you know, Cecilia and Emo, it's often more challenging in terms of having to manage their school workload, entertain them, run the house, and run yourself whilst running a business. So it might be interesting to see some more comments about the impact for members individually there. Perhaps, Cecilia, we can take some questions or observations from the audience. I can see we've got a few popping up.
Yes, we've had a few observations, particularly going back to the quality of relationships in a digital world when you've not had a previous interaction to build some trust already. We have to be aware that some industries are unfortunately heavily reliant on being present within a certain environment to really fully understand the client. This specifically within the healthcare sector. I think as Amanda pointed out, her teams that have to go out with products into hospitals, it's pretty much impossible to run that virtually. They've got to see what the situation is. They're apparently being told that they are sorely being missed due to them having been reluctant to be in the hospitals itself. But some services simply aren't that well communicated or don't translate that well digitally. So there's definitely an argument also to bear in mind that even though there are a lot of services that absolutely can operate remotely, not all of them lend itself to that. We've also had a comment from someone saying, this is from a tech industry, particularly that the head of tech has said he only wants 50% of tech resources working from the offices post-COVID. This is from Jennifer Dudman, with a corresponding reduction in office space. So that all correlates. Tech, again, something you can probably run pretty efficiently remotely, as we've seen happens increasingly, but it has the knock-on effect again with office space that we've also touched on. So we've had people commenting on that. Then we've got from Killian Ryan, good morning, Killian, who says that there's been around about a 70% rebound in commercial traveling in China already. Now, this is another interesting question. I think there are a lot of opinions out there. Some people saying it's going to be a good while before they will get on a plane again. Others saying possibly people like Leon, can't wait to be on the next one. Happy to be that person. But as China has seen a 70% rebound in commercial traveling, do we not believe that it might be the same for the US and Europe? Possibly we could dig into this here. Nick Latta, you might have some insight on it too, but Rian also, I'm just thinking about legally, do you think it might be a whole different can of worms opening? What if people do get sick when they've traveled? What are the risks of litigations for airlines? You know, it's because as we've also seen statistically, being in an enclosed space like that is highly contagious area. So what might people go to in terms of litigation? How do you possibly see that playing out?
Thanks, Cecilia. Maybe before I answer your question, just trying to pick up on some of the comments that was made earlier on, and that relates to, you know, the interdependency of, you know, all of the sectors that we have, and I think that's, you know, somehow have been a missed opportunity thus far as a government's response to the pandemic. You know, we can't just look at a particular sector and say the manufacturing is open as an example, and then, you know, not look at, you know, everything else. As an example, interdependency would be, for instance, your childcare. So it's great for possibly everybody on this room, because now regulations in terms of level 4 says childcarers can come to your house. But the vast majority of the people working in, for instance, the manufacturing sectors simply cannot access child care and someone coming to their home in order to have a look at that. Similarly, you know, business services is another example. You know, it might be that we can work remotely, but most of us are very dependent on some industries that's heavily dependent on, you know, some serious labor force. So if those things don't tick up, then, you know, it's very difficult. Same thing would be, you know, true for the airline industry. You know, it's and there are some interdependencies that we have to look at. But in terms of litigation, maybe just make the following point. I think quite a lot of considering, you know, taking some other form of an action against the government for, you know, whatever regulations may be imposed. And that will be, you know, a different kind of scenario for you know, wherever it is that you find yourself. In South Africa, fortunately for government, you know, when we make use of the Disaster Management Act, you know, that possibility is not there. So, you know, it's for the private sector to, you know, fight their own fights. So it might be that you want to take on government in terms of, you know, the actual regulations that were promulgated, or perhaps the manner in which they were implemented. So you can go and do that kind of thing. But for the rest, it's private sector versus private sector. So if your supplier is not paying you for goods or services you delivered, that's your own indaba. You've got to do that. If you need to organize something with your employees, you know, it's something that you need to organize with them, communicate with them. You know, the principle of no work, no pay applies. But the point I'm trying to make is it becomes very difficult. Then you get to a situation where I think also people are talking and banning about this term called force majeure, or at least as we have it in South Africa, vis maya, and when essentially it's an act of God, or, you know, some other intervention that, you know, the parties can't control. And a lot of people are looking at that kind of legal principle and saying, you know, this is my way out of, you know, some other obligation that I have. The matter of fact is it's not that simple. I mean, I'm not going to go into an expose exactly how that works. But it's not simple, and it's not easy for the private sector to rely on these legal principles in order to, you know, take some sort of an action. And the same thing to get to your point in terms of airlines, it's not that simple. I mean, you know, I hear there are reports out there that it's a highly contagious environment, and, you know, I've also been on flights where you get back and you're not feeling too fresh. But, you know, on the other side, you've got the World Health Organization telling us that, you know, there's no chance of you getting sick on those flights unless you're sitting next to someone and, you know, using the same surface, that kind of issue. So it becomes an administrative burden, you know, and also then an evidentiary burden. How do you make sure that, you know, this is actually something that you can take? And then, of course, the question becomes, you know, what is it that you're claiming? Are you asking them to cease operations? Or are you asking them for damages? What is the damages? Where are you claiming? If you're claiming that in South Africa, damages are not the same kind of quantum as what you're looking for instance in the United States. So these are all considerations I think that people will have to have a look at when they're considering any type of legal intervention.
Yeah.
Thanks, Rian. Nick, some observations there around Cecilia's question and comments from our audience.
So I don't know how globally people will respond. I am struck, and I think that each organization's immediate experience of the crisis will inform its response. So, for example, I'm struck that our organization, very fortunately, just before the week, 10 days before the South African lockdown, was set to have all ambassadors from around the world gather in London. And it made a very sensible decision not to do that, because had it done so, it would have basically put the global leadership into quarantine.
Yeah.
And I think it's not necessarily about the risk of flying that people will be judging. They'll be judging. So if I put my executive on this jet, they will go to a new environment. They will have to get a taxi. They'll be in a hotel. There'll be a raft of uncontrolled space and uncontrolled interactions that they'll go through before they even get to the meeting with our client. And then they come back, and so they've had all these vectors of potential transmission, and then long before they become symptomatic, we bring them back into the boardroom and say, right, tell us about it. The potential for seizing up your entire leadership from that one movement. Yeah. If you don't have a high level of confidence about each stage in that chain, you probably will try and rethink how you have that business conversation, would be my guess. And that's certainly the sense that I'm getting from within the civil service at least in the UK.
And it was right. It was Killian's point. It was fascinating. 70% return to normal, and I think instinctively at the beginning of this, you think people will forget, as we did in 2008 around the financial institutions and the banks. We kind of revert back to type and to behaviour, but this does feel different. Perhaps some of the points that have emerged really for Nick and Rian to address. And Nick, maybe looking at it from an interdependence perspective. So I've got two angles here. Rian talked about interdependence of the workforce and society, but let's extrapolate that and look at what the UK's kind of diplomatic agenda was. We had a Brexit agreement to negotiate this year, which seems to be on the back burner. And, you know, without going down that rabbit hole in detail, doesn't this highlight the requirement for more interdependence, collaboration, coordination internationally? You know, we've all quoted the World Health Organization and are looking to them as, you know, the bastions of our health going forward. How is that going to impact on our kind of global trade? And as we were rehearsing over the weekend, Rian and Cecilia and I were discussing around what is the appetite for investment, you know, from a DIT perspective, to get UK businesses coming into South Africa when people might be looking to wholly own their supply chain because that's the safest way to transact going forward.
So in terms of Brexit's still on. We're still cracking forward with Brexit, even through some of the sharper elements of the lockdown. There was an extensive meeting between UK and Brussels on the modalities of Brexit. Yeah. In terms of our interest and commitment to investments in Africa, I think that will remain. It will probably, as with many things, there will be a hiatus. At the moment, UK government objectives are very narrowly focused around COVID response. If you're not either around vaccines or around PPE or around reporting on how other countries are coming out of a lockdown, then there's very little appetite or interest in what you're talking about, unless you're talking about a coup or something very, very high level. But that will shift, that will change, and it won't. Just as I was clearing out my inbox, a pile of sort of delete and dump stuff, and I found an email from myself to my colleague from the beginning of March saying, "Yeah, I'm just off to the UK and Spain. Currently, there's no issue around travel between those countries and back to South Africa." The world had moved an unbelievable distance in 2 months.
Yeah,
and I think a little bit of context helps us judge where we might be in 2, 3, 4 months' time, rather than judging them on today's criteria.
yeah. Thanks, Nick. And I think we've seen Emma Wade-Smith really communicating extensively about our appetite to maintain trade links with South Africa, and Africa being a very important market for the UK. What are you seeing, Rian, in terms of the global trade piece? And I know you and I touched briefly on Saturday that we all know people that have imports and exports stocks stuck in ports, not being able to move them. They're still getting fines because they can't move their stuff out of port. What are you seeing and hearing?
Yeah, thanks for that, Leon. Now, maybe first from a South African perspective, talking about what we've got under the current lockdown and then also level 4. Even at level 5, we had serious issues at the ports. Ports were only, getting anything in and out, let's just put it that way, was only going to be for essential goods, so essentially food products, medicines, and those kind of things. And even though that was fairly well defined, I'd say, we had many instances where, whether that's on the provider side or on Transnet's side, and when I say the provider, something like the best CIDC, those kind of guys just questioning whether this particular import or export is an essential good, to what extent part of the container may or may not leave or enter the country. And then, even if that wasn't even a question, just inordinate delays, getting around, normally moving from about a 3-day exportation period to roughly a 10-day exportation period, with, like you said, all of the penalties and demurrage fees and all of those kind of things that needs to be paid, the importer, exporter still need to pay for those kind of fees. So that's obviously a massive concern. And then within that period, all other things were not allowed, unless, of course, the stuff was already shipped and was already on the ship and was coming this way. But it wasn't being cleared in the sense that you can now get access to it and do something with those goods or inputs or whatever it is that you brought here. And currently, I think that's going to be roughly the same thing, because the only non-essential type of products that are now allowed to be coming in is goods destined for our neighboring countries that's cleared through South Africa. So that's typically your SACU countries, so the BLNS countries, which is a kind of an odd thing. So you now need to get SARS and Transnet and whoever else may be involved in that particular value chain to increase the number of people working at the ports of entry in order to now sift through stuff that's going to Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, and Swaziland or Ethiopia. And it just seems to be a bit odd that's going to be the case. But I think longer term vision. So obviously there's also massive, kind of like stoppages. It's not even a bottleneck in terms of goods coming from wherever and goods going wherever. People are just sitting in it. It's in the warehouses. You have to incur the cost if it's not already your warehouse. Everybody's waiting with bated breath to hear when is this stuff going to open up, because technically it shouldn't be a high transmission activity. It gets loaded onto a truck and it moves to a border, and there a crane picks it up onto a ship. And it's all operated roughly remotely, save for the inspections. And inspections also can occur at least with one individual opening up a container in order to see what it looks like. So those are all some of the considerations that I think has been difficult from government side to kind of like get the head around and make sure that those things work. And of course, on the other side, you know, things are just waiting. But I also think that this is going to be an opportunity. So both from a trade perspective, but also from an investment perspective, you know, businesses around the world are going to look at this and say, okay, what has been happening within certain economies? What has happened? Has there been a shift in the businesses within those economies? And is there perhaps an opportunity for my business? You're still allowed to operate, as an example, if you're in the UK or in America, or whatever the case may be, in order to grab market share or take the market completely. But, you know, the same is true, of course, for South Africans. South Africans are also able to make use of those opportunities as they present themselves throughout the world. So there's quite a lot of disruption, and I'd probably also use the word tragedy in it, but, you know, with all bad things, there's always a silver lining. And I do think that there's a silver lining in terms of, you know, trade, but also innovation. And some companies will become stronger and new ones will be born, even during this difficult time. And I think there's going to be, you know, great fortunes to be made for some of those businesses.
Yeah, thanks, Rian. As you were talking specifically about goods across borders, you've touched on what David Smith has commented on, saying in instances where you used to have an agent going to check the quality of something being exported, that how will that possibly impact the quality of product from shipments? And I think it might bring something up that I've certainly seen from the chamber side, being approached by people where different contracts are now being disputed because who carries the cost? Whose fault is it if the quality is not the same, if no one was allowed to be there? But as you also pointed out, are the regulations maybe not very reasonable, because is that a very high risk area? So I think that's interesting to touch on. And sort of along the same veins, if you can maybe give us your view, where the agricultural sector seems to have had very little in financial support from government, yet at the same time we're hearing that food security is a major concern. How does that tie up? And I think this brings us to one of our poll questions too, which is how much faith do people have in government's regulation so far? What is the general sentiment out there? Do people think that they've been pretty good so far or not? So next poll, what do you think of government's strategy of a gradual return to economic activity? Do you agree with the regulations? Do you think they are as good as one can do under these circumstances where, let's be honest, no one really knows at the end of the day? But particularly, Rian, on the agri sector, I think that is quite a key point. If we're hearing lots of noise about food security, why have we not seen as much support for the agri sector? And what do the current regulations under level 4, what does it mean for that sector particularly?
Thanks, Cecilia. To answer the agricultural question first, the agriculture has been allowed to operate, you know, since the beginning of lockdown. So in that sense, they're not negatively affected. They were allowed to operate. Of course, they still had to adhere to the workplace and health guidelines that was imposed, you know, relating to social distancing, etc. So I think therein lied some challenges. As an example, if you're thinking of agro-processing, you know, typically they have a factory. But you've got to, you know, at least in those times, you still had to maintain a distance of 1 square meter per person. Often factories are not set up to do that. There wasn't the possibility to erect a physical barrier between the individuals. So these, you know, caused concerns for those agro-processing industries and businesses. Also, you know, the use of disinfectant, making sure that everybody is sanitized throughout, ensuring that the workers are screened and assessed and reported on, you know, at different points in time during the day, at the very least when they arrived at work every morning or when the shift may have started. So those are all issues that they had to grapple with. And they were also subject to inspections to make sure that they do adhere to, you know, whatever's been promulgated at that particular stage. Long and short of it is they were allowed to operate, but within certain confines. And I think some of those confines don't necessarily relate to the actual workspace. It's again going back to things like, how do I make sure that my workers can travel to where it is that they have to be? So we had restrictions on public transport. We had social distancing within those, maximum capacity in terms of the load that the vehicle might carry in terms of the number of people and those kind of things. And where it wasn't possible to make use for that public transport, it was up to the employers to get the workforce to work. And again, another burden, and that's, forgetting about a few things. One of those things is, again, getting back to what happens to my children if I have children. I can't just leave them, especially in some of the communities that some of the workers come from. And it's also getting back to, I think, what was previously mentioned. If government opens up tomorrow, how many people are going to go back? The concerns that you have across the board. I think a lot of people are considering, will I send my kids back to school? Will I want to go back to an office environment where, I'm exposed to 300 people a day? I have to get on the train where I'm exposed to 500 people in the carriage, whatever the case may be, in order to get there. So yes, in the sense that they were allowed to operate within certain constraints, and it might have hampered them. And I think also that government was more lenient towards the agro-processing sector that had a very high demand for peak season, as an example. So if something was harvested that needed to happen right now, I think they kind of turned a blind eye to those kind of things in order to make sure that those things do happen. I mean, we already know that, for instance, the wine sector, they immediately recognized that, there's an issue here. We need to have winemakers at least go back so that they can, ferment and put everything in barrels, and then they can go under lockdown. So certain measures were taken. As to what's going to happen in the future, we should remember that I don't think that we've seen, in any which way or form, the end of this. So I think government is going to slowly listen to everything that is happening. And you might find that within time that there might be additional programs specifically geared towards agriculture and agro-processing. So I think that's a possibility. I think one of the things that I'd really like to see is, it seems to be that, and it's understandable, that all of a sudden there was a rush in order to get things done, and then we brought out regulations and we patched them as we continued, and now we're at the stage where government wants to move fluidly between stages or levels of one, and that's probably all good. There's probably some negatives to that also, but the biggest thing I think around that would be, okay, so we try to do it for level 4. And let's be honest, government let us know on a Saturday that, listen, this is what we think it should look like. And then they gave us until 12 o'clock on Monday, which was a public holiday, to comment. I don't think many comments were received. I've seen the numbers, but it's minuscule versus the amount I think you would have seen had this been open for, let's say, a week. So my hope is that government really takes the time now to say, okay, let's start proactively engaging with the business community, with the social community, etc. And we get comments on what we think level 3, 2, 1, etc. might be. We are cognizant of the fact that, listen, we have, for instance, regulated that e-commerce is bound by the same things that the retail stores are currently bound by. But maybe we should rethink that. Maybe we should garner submissions on it, and we go, okay, let's help people develop e-commerce capability if we don't necessarily want to go through the current existing platforms. And I just think that if we get that benefit of planning in advance, we're going to get certainty. And with that certainty, businesses will be able to innovate because we'll know what we're innovating for. Instead of having this kind of a dance in the dark kind of scenario where we don't know what's going on. And, we hope some clarification is going to come in time. And, it comes on a Thursday, the day before we have to implement the regulations.
Yeah, thanks, Rian. Really interesting. I was speaking with Kim Reed, the CEO of Takealot, yesterday and the day before, because I've observed that Amazon globally are making $10,000 a second during this lockdown period with their ability. And let's be honest, we all have financial concerns, but there's not a great deal of things to do other than shop, you know, so we could actually be keeping the economy mobilized if Takealot were allowed to transact. Equally, if you're a pick and pay, a Spar, a Clicks, a Discount, what's the additional risk of somebody being able to buy, my teenage boy wants to buy protein because he's training every day, but you know, it's non-critical, non-essential. You know, I want to buy some more sports kit because I've got more time to spend training. And you think all these little factors that we could feed back in, which we've not had the opportunity to do so. On that, we had a really constructive meeting, and thanks to Paul Bondi from Rothschild, who's our board member, I believe he's on the call today, introduced us to Kescavadia at Busa. And Paul's really leading the fundraising for Business for South Africa Solidarity Fund, which is going to be critical in terms of helping sustain organizations and people. But really, Cass is saying, talk to your members, Leon, really ask them what kind of structural reform they want to see and what practical reform we want to see. So, you know, as we enter the last 15, 20 minutes, please tell us your views on what the government's doing. I don't think any of us believe they're acting in malice at all. But, you know, we've not had the most efficient optimum economy in recent years. And I believe we now have an ear whereby we can, as a chamber collectively, feedback directly through the economic cluster to really get some economic transformation done, contributed to it. But equally, as Rian said, some real practical advice, like on behalf of Takealot, saying, surely there's no additional risk in opening up these e-commerce chains. How can we help existing organizations transition to e-commerce? And within that, we're going to find opportunities and silver linings. You'll see the poll there. It'd be great to get your feedback. Interestingly, Nick, perhaps we could look at South Africa has had one of the harshest lockdowns globally, particularly if you compare it with the UK and Australia. Just looking at the results there. Yeah, interesting feedback. Yeah, good. Well, please do influence and share with us. But looking at the lockdown in the UK, you know, Rian mentioned the wine industry can now export. Do we believe that the rest of the world is more equipped to handle drinking wine than we are as South Africans? You know, the UK, you can buy wine, all shops open, Amazon is open. What do you see as the way we've come down quite heavily handed here in South Africa versus some of the other lockdowns in the rest of the world? And you made points to perhaps our vulnerable population with TB and HIV. Do you think that shaped a lot of the government policy on this particular agenda?
I can't crystal ball gaze into the discussions in the National Joint Council or anything. My sense is that the alcohol ban is actually much more correlated to concerns about the other epidemics in South Africa around violence. Yeah. Now, alcohol is behind 60+% of, well, was behind 60+% of all hospital admissions before the crisis, and the vast majority of that was alcohol-fueled violence. So that there's a very rational response need to minimize hospital admissions in order to make space in the ICUs and for those beds. So take out the alcohol, take out the opportunities for violence, and you save the health sector. I think has been their approach, and I think I shared with you previously the first week crime statistics I saw, which saw a decline in murders from 350 to just under 100, which is a remarkable achievement given that in 5 weeks of lockdown, we've still only managed just over 100 deaths from COVID, which means that South Africa is still massively life positive between COVID and the reduction in murders. But nevertheless, 100 murders in lockdown points to what the president was highlighting in his address 2 weeks ago around the problems of gender-based violence, because I suspect that's the vast majority of those cases. And 100 murders a week is still a shocking number. So if alcohol is a factor in that, and I know that in talking to the Scotch Whisky Association and the South African Alcohol Association, they have felt under a lot of pressure because of the strong association between alcohol and violence and gender-based violence, long before we got to COVID. So I suspect that is driving quite a lot of the government's thinking at the moment. Yeah. And equally around smoking, I saw something I think it was Dlamini Zuma yesterday was saying that your average cigarette in South Africa is smoked, but is shared between 5 people. Yeah. Now that might not be Ruth's experience, but sorry, Ruth.
Yeah. I'm sure that's not Ruth's experience. Yeah.
But I think that's the driver behind the highly stringent syntaxes.
Yeah, I like the way you position that. Is their problems fueling South Africa's other epidemics? And one of my big frustrations is we have serious other epidemics in South Africa that haven't mobilized such government intervention or decisiveness from our leadership. And maybe if we had that decisive action and intervention, they would not be epidemics, and we would be saving more lives than we are with COVID. I risk being controversial there, but really speaking on behalf of our members, that's a lot of the sentiment that's coming through. So completely agree with you and understand the view around alcohol and cigarettes. Sports equipment, protein, technical goods, batteries, all these other things that we could be buying. Books, how many books? I've read 4 books, recently. I want to buy more books. I think we could be enriching and fueling people's souls and minds and making them physically healthier by opening up other aspects of the economy. And that's a message that I will be feeding back through BUSA to the president. What else? Rian, looking at the move from stage 5 to stage 4, really, what is that going to do in terms of increasing economic output? Is it really going to make an empirical difference, a significant difference? Or is it just a kind of testing the water before we open up the economy more? Or at worst, is it just slightly misguided effort with the best intentions?
Leon, yeah, I think, if COVID-19 made you redundant, then you not without any, means to reinvent yourself. Educational books are allowed to be sold on the level 4. And so too, will you be able to buy laptops and mobile phones so you can, integrate.
I did see that, yeah, it's good news. Yeah.
But unfortunately, light reading won't be tolerated. Yes. It's very difficult to gauge at this stage, and I think that also doing the sums and seeing what the actual impact of all of this is going to be at the end of the day is probably only going to be clear years after this particular pandemic has ended. However, my feeling is a little bit that we're trying as a government to at least very, very, very slightly allow the economy to take a small single breath. But I'm not sure if it's enough. Currently the focus is entirely on goods and manufacturing. I'm no economist, but I do know what substantial portion of our GDP and our economy is made up of services. Those things are not allowed to operate, in the normal sense, unless it is that you can do things, remotely. And again, we've got this interdependency between services and, things being produced. So we haven't yet seen that nexus and, the thought through from government to say, okay, but if I'm opening up this, then maybe I should, consider these guys and buying them or, giving these kind of directions in terms of how that's going to happen. So I really think that this is probably a test case. We're going to allow a little bit of breathing space to come in. We're going to monitor the situation in terms of risk of transmission and rate of infection. And from there, we will see what else it is that we can do. And like I said previously, I just hope that whilst government is taking the stance of waiting to see what's happening, that we at least get information as to what the next phases may look like. And we can influence those. So we can start planning for that, as business sector and as the economy as a whole.
Thanks, Rian. I think that's really key in terms of, as you mentioned, we've got the announcement on Saturday. So how can we prepare our workplaces to be safe for our employees for tomorrow morning? So I think that's something we can certainly feedback around allowing us time to plan and prepare and get the supplies in place and logistics. I'm keen to hear from the audience, kind of key questions you have. Can we perhaps share the results of the poll that share our views on how government has performed in terms of the COVID? So I think there's large support there for the government's activity, which is good. And I think, again, nobody wants to speak ill of the government. I think everyone's aligned that all decisions are being made with the absolute best intentions. But I think as a business community, perhaps we've been ignored for many years around our advice around how to transform the economy. And I think we need to seize this opportunity to, while we have the government are lending us their ear, to support them, but equally as business, say how we can ensure we survive this, we come out of it thriving, fighting, not sitting away at home watching the economy slowly be destroyed. And perhaps here's another final poll. Based on what you know, will your business be able to increase activity under lockdown level 4? I'd be really keen to hear people's views on that. And if not sure, what other questions you have at this stage? Nick, just looking around.
I think
sorry,
there's.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I'm just going to get to there's one question still that we've not addressed yet, but I think I'm going to let Brian Andrew from RS Components answer or pitch the question himself live. Relates to the fact also that we've commented on no one really knows, and there is unfortunately.
Hello, Liam.
Either way we go. There's risk every way we turn, no matter what we do at this stage. There's a risk and no one really knows how to measure it. We don't even have clean data specifically at the stage. It's a risk either way. What Brian was saying, and Brian, I'll let you come on air and post the question live. Let me just see, is Brian still with us? No, he is. Brian, allowed to talk. Brian, if you want to post your question to the panelists. You had a question regarding flattening of the curve.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can hear you. We can hear you. Okay. Go ahead.
So my question really is in terms of, it's trying to understand what the sort of end game is, the government's end game in terms of this. So, we understand that the lockdown was put in place so that they could build the capacity in terms of hospitals. The alcohol ban to reduce the number of people coming into hospitals so that you could scale up the ability to be able to handle a peak sort of infection rate in terms of flattening the curve. We now seem to, from what I understand, we've built that capacity, but yet we're still very concerned with the level of infection rate that we currently have, which is potentially nowhere near what the peak would be. And we sort of seeing that the hospital, the capacity is there, but it's not being utilized. Are we maybe being too conservative in terms of opening up the economy at this point in time? And I think the other thing that I've picked up is everyone talks about the fact that generally most populations, or you're going to land up with 60 to 70% of the population having been infected at some point in time anyway. And at the current rate of infection, how long is that going to take if we're still worried about the fact that if we're going to have a slight increase in infections, we're going to go back to a level 5 lockdown at this point in time? I'm not sure if I'm coming across clearly in terms of that.
Brian, it's a great question, and I have a strong view, but I'll let my fellow panelists respond, perhaps all of us, before I come into it. Nick, I can see you smiling.
It's a really valid challenge. I think that I'd blend my answer to that with an observation I had on your previous question, Leon, which in terms of the shift, I think what the government is learning as it's doing, and there will be an S-curve, a steep S-curve of learning. So Brian said, highlighted that the government was buying itself some time in order to put in place all of the extra capacity it needed. Realistically, 5 weeks is, as the whole world has seen, 5 weeks is no time at all to solve your PPE and your ventilator problems. The 5 week lockdown did a great job of flattening the curve and delaying the peak. It has bought some time that has turned out to be really useful as other people have innovated as well. But it's not like come tomorrow, all of the necessary capacity and all the necessary skills will be in place. And then the other part of it is the South African economy is a very sophisticated economy. It was basically frozen in place, more or less, through the lockdown. And now there is a easing up cog by cog of some of those restrictions in order to understand almost, I suggest, what impact that has both within the economic system, but also then within the health system as well. And there will be close monitoring of what does this do, and what happens if I turn the dial that way or that way. Because you're talking about such complicated models. It's pretty damn hard to understand what each individual element generates. Is this a policy that is dooming us to an eternity? I don't think so. I really don't. But it is, at least initially, firmly driven by the health priority with the economic needs as a secondary.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And I think I'm going to invite my my microbiologist healthcare friend Amanda in to perhaps ask a question there. So I'm just trying to take you off mute, Amanda. Can perhaps I can't seem to do it. Perhaps you could.
She's unmuted.
Yeah,
Unmuted. Okay, cool. Jump in, Amanda. Yeah.
I think from the health sector perspective, Leon, as well, there's still 101 things we don't know, and actually nobody knows it. And I think the sooner the country can get its head around the fact that not only do we not know, but who is in charge does not know either, what the actual outcome is going to be. I think this reminds me of downwind sailing rather than upwind sailing. It's a case of constant adaptation in terms of which hills are you going up, which hills are you coming down, basically. I think there are elements of the South African scenario that mean that we can't just take another country's numbers as a given. I think every country could quite rightly say, as every sales rep does, that they're individual in terms of this, but we have got some particularly special aspects about our communities. That means in some respects we're very hardy, in some respects we're very immune compromised. So I don't know. I think the biggest thing I struggle to come to terms with is this expectation within South Africa that someone knows what they're doing. And I think everyone is finding their way, if that makes sense. And you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. If they hadn't put the lockdown down and thousands of people had died, they'd have been in trouble. They have put the lockdown down, they're still in trouble. So I think it's a national challenge that could we as a nation get our heads around the fact the health sector has not behaved how we expected it to behave. Just because you're a healthcare company doesn't mean you're having a wonderful time at the moment. We're completely decimated. The hospitals are not buying anything at all. So the business it's not just frozen, it's absolutely sledgehammered. And that's being an essential business that was operating all the way through the last month. We're on our knees, basically. So I think we've got some challenges to get through in terms of a mindset that we think someone somewhere is going to tell us what to do. And can we as a nation come to terms with the fact that no one knows what to do at the moment? So they're just making their best estimates and they're hoping we all go along with them.
Thanks for sharing, Amanda. And perhaps we can catch up one-on-one afterwards in terms of what we can communicate and feedback and how we can ensure you guys are sustainable going forward. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Amanda. And Rian, your observations on Brian's initial question,
Yeah, I mean, I can only really echo what Nick has said. One thing is, of course, the flattening of the curve and the great job that it's done. But the other thing I think that Nick has already mentioned in a previous forum is also to remember that our spike is only going to happen when the northern hemisphere no longer has their spike, and then we'll be able to procure what we need. Plus, we're not yet there yet. I mean, I think it was last night that they only announced that, for instance, the Cape Town International Convention Centre is going to be converted into a facility for any particular patients. So there's quite a lot of work that government is still engaging on, and there's quite a lot of constraints in terms of supply chains in order to get what is needed in order to actively manage and then also fight this pandemic. So yes, it's Brian. I think it's a slow easing of the economy under very cautious principles, and it might easily revert back to onerous levels.
Thanks, Rian. I know, Cecilia, you've got some views on this. Perhaps as we're going to enter our last 5 minutes, we can perhaps share our concluding views of a panelist and equally give everyone the last opportunity to raise any questions. So, what's your sense in terms of Brian's question, Cecilia?
I do think it is a difficult thing. There are risks either way. I just think it's, personally, if I look at things playing out, I think we've gotten to a point of no return. I think a lockdown was absolutely needed. I think acting quicker rather than later and preventing an even higher curve was the right thing to do. But I think beyond a certain point, lockdown and isolation simply is no longer an option. Also, that cannot possibly be the solution going forward. So I think other solutions definitely have to be considered and implemented. I think, as I said, risks either way. I lean more towards we've got to now start taking the risks of isolate the vulnerable. The economy has to get going, because I fear the risks, if we stay in lockdown, are even bigger on absolutely every sector and aspect of life and of people's health. So I lean more towards that. Again, I think government has done a good job. I absolutely believe it's done with the best possible intentions, but I do think now the time has come to man up and basically take a risk in a different direction. I think we've had time to try and prepare as much as anyone can possibly prepare at this stage. I also think quite a bit of work has been done, not just in South Africa, but also globally, on finding some different treatment options and exploring these. And I think the time has come to say, this is the next phase that we're going to have to go in. Staying isolated and in complete lockdown simply is not the answer anymore. It's not an option.
Thanks, Cecilia. I think the views I share, and before I come to Nick, and much to the despair of Ema, I'm going to make a military analogy, and I know Robin from Quadrant will perhaps like what I've got to say. And I say this fully in the knowledge that Nick spent time in war zones in Libya and in the Middle East before. But at some point in a fight, you have to win the firefight. And when bullets are flying, you need to stick your head above the parapet as a leader and make a decision conscious of the fact that it's going to be imperfect. There is no perfect solution. And I think it's the moment where nobody really knows what's happening. So leaders need to stand up and take some bullets so we can start moving forward. And I think as a chamber, we want to lead by being your voice to say, what risks are we prepared to take to achieve the greater good, to get us moving, to ensure all those secondary epidemics that Nick's rightly referred to don't become pandemics, and indeed we navigate the risks of COVID. And I think we need to have a stronger voice. We need to support government. We need to feed back to them respectfully and robustly, while saying we're here to support you, because actually what this pandemic has showed us, there is nowhere to run to. I can go and get my hair cut in Sweden and Switzerland and have a lunch, but I really will then struggle to get back in the country. So we really are all in this together. So we need to really forge these these channels and really communicate robustly around what we think we need to do. And so with that, Nick, with my sympathy and respect for where government is, you know, do you see us embracing more of an appetite for risk? We have flattened the curve, but as Brian said, you know, at some point we need to get 60, 70% to have some type of herd immunity. Are we going to wait 2 years for a vaccine to come in? And like you say, each day buys us more time. So the Ebola treatments, some of the malaria treatments that the military are trialing, getting the Nightingale Hospital set up in the UK, the Convention Centre in Cape Town. You know, at some point we need to kind of come out of cover and face the fire and start moving forward. I'd like to know if Robin liked that analogy as well. You
know. I'm less convinced by the military analogy on this.
Eva will support you there. Yeah.
In that, yeah. the purpose of breaking cover is to deliver a decisive assault on the enemy. Breaking cover now, going back to business as usual, does not achieve that in any shape or form. So I think the analogy doesn't hold good through the process. Picking up on Cecilia's point, I think we need to think about this, and this is what the level system is designed to do. This isn't a binary choice between lockdown or returning to the cafe culture, and everything is good to go. I think there will be a myriad of small victories and small easing up. And on that point, I'm going to finish with a positive note, because at the beginning of the week, I thought that my level 4 dividend would mean I could walk around the block. Yeah, they were talking about 500 meters, no further than 500 meters from your house. It's now gone to 5 kilometers. I mean, that is a big easing up. There are all sorts of other areas where the curfew has come in and there's actually continued or tighter control. But I think that there is a piece about celebrating the small wins and spotting that as they come in, and they will keep coming in, I suspect, as the dialogue with business improves, as the government learns better how to regulate and to implement all these high-level decisions that they're taking.
Yeah. Thanks, Nick. And that's a really good silver lining for you to conclude on. And thanks for coming.
I must say, I wish I was more like Nick. Nick seems wonderfully easy to please. I love it. You will die a happy man, Nick.
Yeah. Thanks, Nick. On our next 1 o'clock, we'll get Robin in and the Quadrant guys and discuss that military analogy at length. But I know you talk from experience in war zone. So really appreciate you contributing, representing the High Commission today and sharing your views. Thanks so much. Rian, perhaps some concluding observations from yourself and maybe one silver lining you can see coming from where we are right now.
I think, picking up on Nick's silver lining, I think my wife was ecstatic this morning when she heard that I can eventually again go to the hardware stores and get through my long list of things that I had to do around the house over many years. But other than that, I also want to pick up on something Nick said. As South African business and a South African government, I think we have a very deep history of distrust. And there's very little engagement. There's engagement, but there's very little engagement. Now is not the time for that. I urge all businesses out there to go pick up the regulations, read it, engage with whoever it is that you may have to engage with. If you're a chamber member, engage with them. But honestly, go through the trouble of making a difference, because the only way in terms of which we're going to get out of this economically in an okay-ish way is if we all pull together, we all are informed, we all make plans, and we all start innovating. And that's my silver lining. I think it's a great opportunity for guys to get back out there and hopefully, to use the analogy, hit it out of the ballpark.
Yeah. Thanks, Rian. That's a great message. And Cecilia?
No, I think I've said my piece. I think that there definitely are silver linings. Great things have come from this. People have gotten really creative. We've learned a few things about ourselves and about our businesses, maybe exposed some of the weaknesses and rapidly developed some new strengths. So there's always something good to come out of it. Yeah, I just like to see things or an equal force of creativity and energy as we move through the next few phases as we slowly come out of lockdown. But that there's, I think just my feeling is more towards we need to put as much energy into venturing out there again in a controlled, sensible way, of course, and to making the economy work, and not just maybe a fix-it, hold back, cautious approach, and putting the energy in there. But again, we just don't really know. As Amanda also said, this is going to be trial and error. So I think as long as we all remain open to that. Sorry, what am I? As long as we all remain open to that and remain open to adapting, I think we can make it.
Thanks, Cecilia. I just think that there is no perfect solution to this, and I think and essentially we were running out of time, so I'm going to conclude. But there are so many points and questions we haven't come to yet. The opening of the schools, childcare. So I'm going to propose and invite Rian and Nick to join us again in another iteration of this. Perhaps when we have more meat on the bones in terms of the details of this relaxation of economic activity. I just say, putting my hand up, representing the chamber, to say, you know, I'm ready and we're ready to break cover for you, and we want to represent you, our members, and serve you by really relaying your concerns very robustly and respectfully through particularly the Business for South Africa channel. So please, if we've not answered your question, respond to this invite. Tell us what you're feeling, what your concerns are, and let us kind of advocate for you. And you'll see me making some noise in the media over the coming weeks. I want to thank Rian and Nick for joining us. Real high quality inputs. Thank you so much. I will be inviting you both to again. Thank you for Cecilia for being our moderator and feeding the questions in. EMA Mission Control, and of course Leslie getting the invites out, and Vanessa always supporting us, the operational backbone. Wish everybody a great 5 kilometer run at 5 o'clock tomorrow morning. You have to wait slightly longer for your cigarettes, but please stay in touch, and I look forward to seeing you all very soon. Stay safe. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks.